All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. And just welcome for the updates on the North American Low Carbon Fuel Standard programs. Don't be deceived by this boring title. This is going to be a pretty good session. See, already, lights are responding. This is going to be fun. We're going to have a good time, and we're going to talk about a number of things. One, a little bit where low carbon fuel standard programs have been, a little bit on that, a little bit on where we are and where we're going. And maybe even along the way, we'll have a few predictions here that should be pretty interesting. But I wanted to make a point. In a minute, I'll introduce the panelists, and we'll hear from them. But I have the mic, and I'm going to use it for a few minutes from an overall observation standpoint. But I wanted to just note that a lot of folks are talking about low carbon fuel standard related programs, certainly in California and Washington, New Mexico, several other states, nationally, internationally, and that's important. A range of folks, a range of expertise, disciplines. But I wanted to note, and this is really important, that the panelists, all three of them, have directly developed regulations for low carbon fuel standard programs and had implemented them. They've implemented so for many, many years. And with that said, I just pay a lot of attention to what these folks have to say here. I think it's important. Some may be in code. Listen carefully. But it should be pretty good. So about myself briefly, I'm Richard Corey. I'm with a energy transition consulting firm, but prior to that, I was with CARB for many decades, and that time included the early years, in fact, the beginning years of low carbon fuel standards, since that's a topic here, and its ultimate development and implementation. And personal observation, I have seen that program as wildly successful, and I say that because of basic metrics. First, substantial GHG reductions, millions of metric tons. 60% of the renewable diesel pool in California, or of the diesel pool in California, is now renewable. Hundreds of billions of dollars of investments in clean fuels, biomethane, biodiesel, renewable hydrogen, electricity, renewable dimethyl ether, broad range of fuels that are responding to the signal that the program has sent. In addition to that, significant criteria pollutant reductions, NOx, diesel PM, toxic pollutants. So the evidence is irrefutable. We'll talk about that. And I'm going to be really interested in the panelist assessment, which is going to be critical here. But with that said, the program is certainly not without some controversy. You guys have heard. But as I was reflecting on the last 14 years, the early years of the development of low carbon fuel standard in California was 2008, and then adopted in 2009, early implementation 2010, CI reduction began in 2011. I think people forget the program was sued multiple times back then. So if people talk about uncertainty, talk about lawsuits that are challenging the basic authority to implement and enforce the program. There was also an initiative along the way to repeal California. Does this sound familiar? Repeal California's authority, actually broad authority to implement its climate program. That went down convincingly. So as I'm thinking about some of the conversation here and some of the issues and challenges that come up, they don't sound all that new. Many of them sound pretty familiar. Also, it's pretty clear today, I just touched on the historical perspective on the program. Pretty clear from the science, you guys know this, we need to do more from a climate standpoint in terms of a mitigation. We need to do it more, and we need to do it faster. And certainly in California and Washington, they have statutory mandates to reduce GHG emissions. That requires focusing on effective programs that work. So in my humble opinion, low carbon fuel standard is not only here to stay, it's going to get significantly more stringent because it works and it's effectively delivering the renewable fuels that we just talked about and supporting electrification But reflecting a little bit on some stakeholders would like to see the program exclusively focus on support for electrification. In other words, clean fuels, not generate credits, even low CI clean fuels. And that misses a key point, and the point's this. Even with wild success in terms of transition to electrification, for instance, California's program, if you have 100% EV sales, light duty, by 2035, if you have the transition to heavy duty electrification, in 2045, 2050, the on-road fleet, substantial, 30% on heavy duty, is still going to be in liquid fuels. We're going to be in liquid fuels for decades. We need to do both, and we can do both at the same time, effectively transition to electrification and develop and produce and support cleaner fuels. It's going to be critically important. And last point before we get to the panelists, and that is, it's really a point about an observation. It's really applicable to each of these folks and their teams, and that is public process matters a lot. We're obviously having a conversation here today, but public process with enviro groups, EJ groups, community groups, industry, as regulations are developed, it's critically important. Hear everyone out. Hear them out. Have the questions. Have a process. And the vetting process that these folks all go through is fundamental to developing good policy. Doesn't mean you agree with everyone. Doesn't mean you agree. It doesn't mean the program doesn't need to continue to be tethered to facts, science, evidence. That's what they all hold these programs to. That's what ultimately wins the day. So when I think about this program and my confidence in it going forward in a more stringent way and even more effective than it's been, it's these folks and their teams. And effective execution gives me a lot of confidence and pride, honestly, in what's happening here in California, Washington, and in our partner states. So I'm going to stop, but I'm going to ask, before we get to questions, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, just give a little background on their role in the low carbon fuel standard and any overall perspective that they want to share. They can take just a few minutes. And then after that, we're going to go to questions. I have some questions to ask you guys. And then we'll leave some time for audience questions. But overall observation here. This is we're in our family room here. It's a big family room, but we're in a family room having a conversation. We decided not to do a kitchen. Just thought it was smarter to go with the family room. They all asked, and do not bore them with, they got to be tough questions. They want really hard, controversial questions because you're trying to keep them awake here. So don't hold those questions, have them ready to go when we turn to you. So with that, I'm just going to go and order the lineup here and go to Matt first.
Sure. It's on. Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Could always rely on you to deliver some of our speaking points. I appreciate it. Matt Botill, I'm the Division Chief of the Industrial Strategies Division at the California Air Resources Board. So my role, I have been in this leadership position now for going on 4 years. I worked really closely in California with a number of stakeholders to help develop and move and get approval on the state's scoping plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And now I'm taking on the position of helping to shepherd the LCFS regulatory updates through our board so that we can update that program to help us achieve our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that we have for 2030 and 2045. And, when I think about the LCFS, when I think about California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, I think about the history that Richard just touched on, the fact that this program has been a bedrock program at CARB and in California to support the ongoing decarbonization of the transportation fuel pool. I think about its importance to supporting our broad portfolio of greenhouse gas emission reduction programs, including our clean vehicle regulations that we have that rely on the low carbon fuel standard to help reduce the cost of those next generation low carbon fuels that we need to decarbonize. And I think about all of the people in this room. I think about this conference and what this conference typically means, which is unlocking investment into climate change solutions, bringing people that want to solve this problem, that want to put money into greenhouse gas reductions. And I think about how the LCFS historically has been very successful in doing that and how important that is for California going forward. So I just, I'll keep it brief, but I want to really reiterate something that Richard said here, which is, yes, we're updating the program. Yes, you see a lot of news articles. You probably have watched some of the workshops, and you're wondering about all of this noise. This is nothing new. We've updated this program consistently over time. We've brought it through, received approval from our board, and we've used it to support our climate objectives in California. And its success has meant that we've seen other jurisdictions picking up similar programs, growing the markets for clean fuels, not just in California, but across the world. And so that is not lost on us, and we take that position very seriously, and we are going to use this program for our climate strategy over the long haul. I'll pass to Joel.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Joel Creswell, Climate Pollution Reduction Program Manager at the Department of Ecology. That is a new group that our director created about 6-7 months ago to encompass all of our greenhouse gas mitigation work going on at the agency. But before I was in that role, I was overseeing Ecology's climate policy section, which is where the clean fuel standard was stood up. So I've certainly been involved with that policy at Ecology since the beginning, but not since the beginning of sort of the policy thinking and development around clean fuels in Washington State. So I thought it was helpful that Matt and Richard both went back to kind of the inception of clean fuels policy in California. Washington actually got started with its journey towards clean fuels policy around the same time. I think it was 2009 that the first study took place looking at what a clean fuels policy would mean for Washington State. We like to be a little bit competitive with California, and in this case, they won. They got it done first. But the advantage that we had in going third, actually, because Oregon also got their policy in place before we did, was that we were able to learn from both what they did well and maybe areas where we thought there was room for improvement and develop a program that we think is really great. So our program stood up in 2023. The bill that mandated its creation was passed by the legislature in 2021. And then we were given 18 months to develop and launch the program, which any of you who are familiar with government rulemaking processes and staffing up and all the development that goes into implementation knows that's an incredibly fast timeline. But we got it done, and it has been really, in my very humble, unbiased opinion, a raging success so far. We have 372 participants. We had 372 participants in the first year of the program. We've had really strong participation from liquid renewable fuels, and we've seen a lot of increase in the availability of certain alternative fuels in the state, especially renewable diesel. That's also been seen in Oregon and in California. We think that's really positive. We are just about to complete our first full year of reporting. For those of you who are less familiar with the program, the reporting is lagged by several months behind the actual quarter, so we're bringing in Q4 of 2023 reports now. Our monthly average credit price has fluctuated between $74 and $106 per credit, and credit's equal to a metric ton. And the price for February, which is the most recent data month, was just under $90. So that's nicely within the range set by Oregon and California. That was something that our legislature directed us to do, was to build a program that sort of maintained a price that was generally within range of the other jurisdictions. Some other developments in our program, we just recently opened capacity crediting for DC fast chargers. If you're not familiar, this is an opportunity to generate partial credit for putting infrastructure in place, making it available to the public. People generate more credits if the infrastructure is actually used, but this partial crediting for making infrastructure available helps offset the cost, the upfront cost of making these investments in infrastructure. And then a new area that we're really excited about in Washington is sustainable aviation fuel development. So SAF has been eligible for crediting under our program since its inception, but last year, 2023, our legislature passed a bill that gives Washington the most generous SAF subsidies in the country. It made some changes to make more forms of SAF eligible for crediting under the Clean Fuel Standard, and it also created a state tax credit dependent on carbon intensity of the fuel that starts at a 50% carbon intensity reduction with a $1 a gallon credit, and then scales to a $2 a gallon credit for 100% carbon intensity reduction. And that stacks on top of the clean fuels credits and is based on the same carbon intensity assessment. What we're seeing in Washington that we think as a result is 4 or 5 companies that are in different stages of planning and construction for sustainable aviation fuel facilities in Washington. That's something that we're pretty excited about, and if you caught the governor's remarks yesterday during the keynote, he's especially excited. I can't match his level of enthusiasm, but we think it's a great trend in Washington. And then the final table-setting detail that I want to leave you with is that, like California, we are making updates to our program. Now, I know I mentioned that we just did our initial rulemaking and we just launched the program, but these programs are designed to be dynamic and to grow over time. And also there were some elements to the program that we weren't able to do in the initial rulemaking because there's only so much time and our stakeholders only have so much bandwidth. One of those is third-party verification. We'll be bringing that online. We'll also be making some updates to the rules to incorporate some of those changes in how we treat SAF that I talked about. So that rulemaking was launched in December, and now we're in the informal comment process, and we would invite all of you to go take a look at the scope of the rulemaking and send in any thoughts and comments you have for us on how we can improve our program. And with that, I'll hand off to Sam.
Yeah, great to be with you. I'm Sam Wade. I'm Director of Public Policy for the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. We're a national trade association with over 400 members, headquartered here in California, but we work both federally and at the state level across the U.S. and a bit in Canada. My background with the Low Carbon Fuel Standard is I did have the pleasure of working with Richard and Matt at CARB for almost 10 years, and I ran the LCFS for 4 of those, so certainly have a deep experience with the policy and think it's fantastic. Our coalition and the RNG industry as a whole is a very big supporter of this style of policy that recognizes life cycle carbon intensity performance of clean fuels like RNG, and especially recognizes the methane reduction benefits of many RNG projects. And that type of life cycle scoring has actually now made its way into the federal tax code as well, in the Inflation Reduction Act, in the 45V hydrogen tax credits and 45Z clean fuel credits. So California and Washington, Oregon's influence through these programs has helped set federal fuel policy at this stage. And we're also very active in trying to promote clean fuel standard programs in other states. We just had New Mexico pass their CFS legislation this year, which is extremely exciting. So the RNG industry continues to applaud this work and the collaboration across the West Coast on clean fuel standards, and thinks that it's going to be critical to increase the ambition of these programs and continue to use them as a strong driver of greenhouse gas abatement.
Well, thanks, you guys. I think that pretty much says it all. So we're going to wrap up this session here. A few questions for you guys. I'm going to start with you, Sam. You heard some of the panelists already touched on this, but I want to see if you want to add what your perspective is on what are the most notable successes of the program? What would you say?
Yeah, with respect to renewable natural gas, which is obviously where I spend the bulk of my time now, it really transformed the fuel used in California's natural gas vehicles from being completely fossil gas at the beginning of the program to now essentially being 100% renewable natural gas. And over that sort of transition, initially there was a lot of landfill gas tapped, and then more recently it's been dairy gas and other low CI sources of gas. So you even now have some RNG on RNG competition within the CNG fleet. And that's been a fantastic story for California because obviously it's a big dairy state and it had a lot of methane emissions coming from dairy manure management. And turning that into something useful through the LCFS has been a really positive story overall for us. We of course, support and recognize the penetration of the other clean fuels as well, and the fact you're over 60% renewable diesel, as Richard mentioned, is fantastic. And Matt just had a slide presented recently at the EJAC meeting where, I mean, yeah, you highlighted it perfectly, Matt, right? Like 12.6% reduction in carbon intensity overall, over 25 billion gallons of petroleum fuel displaced by low carbon fuels, and approximately $4 billion annually to support low carbon fuel investments. So, I mean, those are some key highlights outside of RNG that we really support and see as key outcomes of this program so far.
Do you want to add, Matt?
I'll add to this too. Yeah, I think Sam's right, and those outcomes are real fuels coming into California, diversifying the transportation fuel pool, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions now in that fuel pool. And the conversation 10 years ago, when we were launching our climate policy 15 years ago, how do we get out of fossil fuels, high emitting, high greenhouse gas intensive fuels in our transportation fuel pools? California, almost over 50% of the emissions on the greenhouse gas side from transportation. Similar story in many other jurisdictions. We love our cars, we love our trucks, we love to drive around. We need to reduce those emissions. And seeing how the LCFS, through its declining carbon intensity standard, has unlocked innovation and diversification in the fuel pool and driven down those emissions over the last 5 years in particular, a huge success. So the other thing that I'll mention is the way in which this policy works. I spent a number of years working on the grants side, and for those of you that have done public sector grants, you know the challenges that can come with public sector grants. They're great, but it's very feast or famine. Here comes some money, move it quickly, get a project going, and it may dry up. On the LCFS side, the program structure where we're having fossil fuel producers generate deficits, pay for credits in this program to renewable fuel producers, provides this ongoing revenue stream to continue the fuel production, keep those facilities going, and to innovate and reduce their carbon intensity over time. It gives that incentive. It creates the structure to really continue the progress and enhance that progress over time instead of this feast or famine that can happen with the typical public sector grant model. So just the model itself has been hugely successful.
Nice, thanks. Joel, are low carbon fuel standard programs benefiting communities?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think there are a lot of ways that this benefits communities. The first one that it's important not to overlook is that this is reducing transportation emissions. And so a lot of our communities that are overburdened by environmental pollution, that are subject to some of the worst effects of climate change, also happen to live near ports, near roadways, near airports, near transportation corridors. As our emissions go down, everybody benefits, and these communities benefit the most. So I think that's really important. There are also a couple of ways in which these programs have built-in mechanisms to make sure that some of the financial benefits that Matt was just talking about are flowing back to communities. So in Washington, as well as in California, there are mechanisms to ensure that credit revenues that are generated by electric utilities for serving power to electric vehicles get invested in communities to the benefit of low-income ratepayers and low-income residents. That takes a bunch of different forms. California has some vehicle rebates that are available. Washington has investments in community car shares. Utilities also have the option to do vehicle rebates. Our program is much newer, so there's much less that's been developed on this front, but we're really excited to see what happens. Something that we have in Washington also is a backstop aggregator. And that is a nonprofit that has a mission to take revenue. They basically take the revenue from EV charging that electric utilities don't claim. Some of the smaller utilities might not want the administrative overhead of claiming that credit revenue. That all goes to the backstop aggregator, who then invests it in low-income communities in those utilities districts to make sure that everybody is seeing the benefits of this. So that's a model that's been really successful in Oregon for a handful of years. And we're excited to see it play out in Washington, too. So a number of ways that the clean fuels programs on their own, in addition to all of the other complementary climate policies that our states have that are designed to make sure that benefits go to low-income and overburdened communities, the LCFS programs as well are providing benefits directly.
Great.
I
Go for it.
can't help myself. All right. So I'm going to yes and Joel's points here because many of the policy design aspects that he mentioned about EV crediting going back into households are true for California, but I want to add a couple of points too. And when a jurisdiction is thinking about, should they adopt an LCFS program, I think this is one of those key conversations that they should have with their advocacy groups, with their communities, to understand what options exist to help tailor an LCFS program that could bring more benefits where needed, whether it's through ZEV deployment or lower carbon fuels. And I'm going to give an example of how that worked in California. So in addition to the support for light-duty zero-emission vehicles, the LCFS also credits things like zero-emission transit. So transit agencies in California receive crediting for battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell fueling that's happening. They also have the opportunity to take advantage of these things called capacity credits that will help build infrastructure so that they can support their transit transition into zero-emission vehicles, which is a huge priority for California, both on the regulatory side and for communities. There's another example, which is we're here in San Francisco. This conference is often down in Anaheim in past years. Two of the biggest port complexes in the world, between Oakland and Port of LA and Long Beach here in California. Those communities near those port complexes have suffered disproportionately from poor air quality that's driven primarily from the goods movement that happens, and the diesel trucks and the ships and the other off-road equipment that operate at those port complexes. The LCFS has helped to change that narrative by providing zero-emission charging for ships at berth, significantly cutting emissions from those ships as they plug in instead of idle at berth, for cargo handling equipment, for forklifts, and for the drayage trucks operating into those communities. Those are real air quality benefits, and those are coming from the LCFS, and they're getting supported through the credits that are generated from that charging and that zero-emission vehicle activity that's happening at those ports. And so that's a specific thing that was a real priority for California, and we're seeing that happen, and those benefits go into those communities in this program.
Hey, thanks, Matt. And I want to key off of something you touched on and go to you, Sam. And Sam, with respect to other states and their consideration of adopting low-carbon fuel standard-like programs, what's helping or hurting uptake?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the West Coast examples need to remain strong and need to continue to demonstrate progress. Obviously, some of the uncertainty around the recent California rulemaking and the lower credit prices and a lot of the negative press coverage is impacting our ability to push for these types of policies in other states. Many other states, like for example New York, where we've been pretty active with the Clean Fuel Coalition for quite some time, they have the same political dynamics as California, where there are some voices that prefer to focus on electrification only or as the primary tool in transportation. And on the other side, of course, there's the clean fuel voices who are trying to say we have a helpful near-term set of technologies that in the long run transition to aviation and other hard-to electrify sectors. So that dynamic, the fight occurs in California first, and to some extent Washington, and then is mirrored in other states. And so if we don't have a strong outcome in California, the other states are going to be reluctant to act. And there's a paralysis right now to some extent. They're looking around for options to decarbonize. Again, New York passed their Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, I believe almost 5 years ago now, and they haven't implemented any major program to effectuate actual reductions in that state yet. They're looking to California for leadership. They're looking to the West Coast for leadership, Washington as well. And they are confused by the narrative out here. So other states do look to California for leadership, and they need to see a successful program in order to feel comfortable politically following or even innovating and creating their own version of it, as the Midwest is trying to do. So at the end of the day, success in the existing programs is critical for adoption of new programs. Adoption of new programs is critical for actually achieving the climate objectives. And so we have to be sure the West Coast programs work well.
Thanks, Sam. And I'm going to go to a related question on that. I'm going to start with you, Matt, then go right to Joel on this one. And it's really a claim that is made here and in other states about the low-carbon fuel standard, the claim that it leads to significant run-ups in fuel prices, adversely impacting those that are most vulnerable. How do you respond to that claim?
Yeah, no, certainly get this one a lot. And, I want to just come at this directly and say, we don't see any direct correlation between the prices that people pay at the pump and the LCFS credit prices. And, the situation in California with respect to fuel prices, we have now, as a result of the LCFS, a strong diversification of the fuel supply that is happening. Take what our pre-existing situation was, we're at 9 refineries. Now it was, a little bit more in the last decade, to where our fuel pathways are under the LCFS, over 1,300 different fuel pathways bringing fuel into California. That diversification gives options to consumers, and it helps to provide competitiveness in the fuel market. The other thing that we've recognized, and there's been numerous studies on this, is that as we move towards more efficient modes of transport, as we move towards zero-emission vehicles, for instance, we're going to save money. We're going to save money from that efficiency gain that comes from those fuels, and from the diversification that comes from them. And so this concern that has been risen, or that keeps rising up about costs, honestly, we view it as a talking point that's coming from the oil industry, who is concerned and doesn't want to see these types of policies proliferate. And we're pushing hard to make sure that we can have programs like LCFS that are designed to provide cost-effective reductions, cap and trade's another one, to meet our climate objectives, that provide flexibility in how we get there with respect to the types of technologies and fuels that can come, and support innovation to help reduce those costs for fuel production. LCFS is definitely a strategy to do it, and it's helping to offset some of the costs in the other sectors where we're pushing technology through typical command and control regulations.
Yes, I want to double down on a couple of Matt's points. In Washington, similarly, we see no evidence that climate policies are a primary driver of gas prices. They still follow the same annual trends that we've seen for a really long time. When there are spikes in the global commodity market, those affect gas prices far more than anything that could be attributed to our policies. And then, again, Matt said this, I'll just say it in a slightly different way. All of this diversification is reducing demand for fossil fuels, and reducing demand is a great way to take down some of that price pressure. And so as we have greater fuel diversity in the market, as we have greater technology options, people start to have more and more options to switch away from gasoline and diesel, which used to be the only way to power your vehicle. So we see a lot of positivity there. A corollary to the argument that you made, Richard, is that as more and more states come online, maybe you'll just have more and more competition for a limited pool of alternative fuels, and maybe that'll drive prices up even more. And we also don't see that happening. I mentioned all of the sustainable aviation fuel facility development going on in Washington right now. And of course, facilities that make sustainable aviation fuel typically also make renewable diesel. And we have a lot more feedstocks in the world. We have a lot more technology development to happen. And there are so many alternative fuel technologies that are really early on their technology development curves. These policies are going to drive advancement of that technology, which is going to bring costs down. It's going to increase options. And so what we really see as more states come online with their own clean fuels policies, as New Mexico is just starting down doing this year, we're going to see economies of scale in this technology development that we think is also really going to help accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels in the transportation sector.
Yeah, I think to piggyback on Joel's last point there, RNG developers love to see the proliferation of multiple programs like this, because otherwise, if you're relying on only one program, there's so much stroke of the pen risk, or there's so much potential price risk associated with low prices in one system. So having multiple programs out there is great for investment in low carbon fuels and makes the thesis much better for our members. And going back to the broader point of how do these programs impact consumer costs associated with complying with climate goals, they bring it down relative to the alternative, right? If you have a broad portfolio of clean fuels that you're attempting to access and you're promoting innovation through market-based systems, you're going to get the lowest cost outcome. And use of fuels like renewable natural gas, especially from both inside and outside of California, is going to be critical to maintain consumer impacts at a level that is politically acceptable. And that's always been the debate, is how fast can we move? Initially, when we set this program up, we thought, oh, maybe not very fast in transportation. It might be a sector that's hard to decarbonize. That turned out to not fully be the case, right? As we're seeing the huge build out in clean fuels coming toward California right now, and unfortunately low credit prices as a result of that, we're a victim of our own success to some extent, right? The program has over-complied, and it's turned out to be easier than expected to make and bring clean fuels to California. So that's a great story. It's time to celebrate that success and double down on it to some extent.
Helpful, you guys. I'm going to stay in the claims lane because it's good to just go directly at some of these. I'm going to start with you again, Matt, on this one. There are calls by some, and it clearly was raised at the last week's Environmental Justice Advisory Committee meeting, calls for establishing caps for crop-based feedstocks under the low-carbon fuel standard, asserting associated harms or concerns about future harms. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. So, as a regulator, as an administrator of a low-carbon fuel standard, we have to stay on the side of facts and data, and we have to make sure that that is foundational to every decision that we make. And so we've had, for the better part of a year plus now, an ongoing dialogue with the broader stakeholder community about what data, what information should we be looking at to address potential concerns about crop-based biofuels. The data that we have right now is that there are feedstocks that are available, both in the waste oils, UCO, and also in the virgin oils to help build out and support the production of biomass-based diesel facilities, and that those fuels are coming to California and they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions in California, and that they're reducing criteria pollutant emissions as well, which is an important co-benefit of the LCFS program for California and for CARB. And so the question that's been raised about crop-based biofuels has been one of a concern about future impacts. And so we've, again, reiterated, let us see what kind of information, what data do you have, and then also how can we think about going forward on these programs, things like sustainability guardrails, so that we can avoid a future that they're concerned about, but that we haven't actually seen happen yet. I do think, for the folks in this room, some of you maybe biofuels producers will be working in this market, I think continued engagement on this topic is crucial. Being able to come forward with the information on what you're seeing on your production facilities, what you're seeing with respect to feedstock availability, making sure that that is available publicly, will certainly help here in this conversation, because like I said, it's got to be grounded in the facts and the information that's available on what's actually happening on the feedstock market right now.
Can't overstate the importance of that homework assignment. Joel?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. Our program is, of course, much newer, and so this isn't really an issue that has come up in as significant a way as California's has. We are watching closely what's going on in California because we do think that this is an issue that will arise as we sort of achieve greater renewable fuels penetration into our marketplace. But for now, the way that we assess the carbon intensity of feedstocks is mirrored directly after what's done in California, and we'll be watching closely what they're doing and figuring out what makes sense for Washington in the future.
One great part about my current job is I don't have to think about indirect land use change very frequently. But I would say that an advantage of waste-derived renewable fuels, like obviously renewable natural gas, is that it creates closed loop, sort of circular economy situations. And we should maximize the use of waste-derived feedstocks first and foremost. The CI scoring in the LCFS does that pretty effectively. And anytime folks begin to consider, like, hey, should we adjust the RNG crediting or pull it out of the framework, I remind them, well, I mean, you're taking that out and you're going to replace it with more pressure on renewable diesel feedstocks to some extent. So we try and be clear with policymakers around that fact, and we're very supportive of waste-derived fuels being recognized for the benefits they provide.
Yeah, and I think Sam raises a good point too, which is, as we think about the future of these programs and as we think about the current fuel market, we also have to ask, what is the alternative? Like, what alternative is available to be able to meet the fuel demand that we have in California and more broadly? And, right now, if we're going to do something like limit the availability of biomass-based fuels, for instance. For many sectors, the alternative is more fossil fuels. We're making progress on getting out of fossil fuels. We want to continue that progress. Going backwards and continuing to accept more of those fuels into the transportation fuel system is not where we want to be. And so making sure that we're taking advantage of the success that we have in the penetration that biofuels have provided into the fuels market, keeping an eye on what data and information is available about potential additional risks, relying on the science when it comes to the information we have on indirect land use change, and making adjustments as necessary going forward, but not falling back into a place of more fossil fuel use into California.
Excellent. Sam, going back to you, related to Matt's point, you're clearly familiar with the ambition statutory targets, GHG reduction targets in California, but as well as other states. How important low carbon fuel standard achievement of those targets?
Critical, right? I mean, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in California, and the LCFS is the primary driver of changing the emissions profile of that sector. So we have to keep using this tool, and we have to have the tool continue to evolve in stringency, at least at the pace of the overall economy-wide reductions, if not greater, if possible. So again, going back to my point that decarbonizing the transportation fuel mix actually has turned out to be easier than anticipated. That's a fantastic story because it's such a big part of the overall pie with respect to the state's emissions. So we strongly encourage CARB to continue to look at the overall ambition in this rulemaking and consider targets that are more ambitious. We would like to see a target on the order of 25% for 2025 and something in the 30s or even the low 40s for 2030. And again, the economy-wide goal is a 40% reduction. The scoping plan said we need a 48% reduction economy-wide to hit our long-run goals. So transportation fuels can do more. The Californians are paying for these renewable fuel assets to be built. Let's go ahead and accept that and move forward ambitiously rather than being afraid to use the tools that are proven to work.
Yeah, I would say it's critical in Washington as well. So our statutory limit is a 45% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030, and the Clean Fuel Standard is a really significant piece of how we're going to get there. Transportation it's our largest source of GHG emissions. It's around 45%, and so of course it's the suite of policies that are all complementarily, that's a word, reducing emissions in the transportation sector. You have the Clean Fuel Standard, you have the Zero Emission Vehicles Program, and you have the Cap and Invest Program. And as Chair Randolph said in her keynote remarks yesterday, the Zero Emission Vehicles Program sort of tells us where we're going, at least in the light duty space, and there are other complementary programs in the medium and heavy duty spaces. And the Clean Fuel Standard, or LCFS, provides the financial mechanism to help us get there.
Excellent. And I touched at the beginning just the experience of this team. So when you're reflecting on states that have recently passed legislation, New Mexico, to move forward on a clean fuel standard, low carbon fuel standard like program, or other states that are considering, what's your counsel? And I'm going to start with you, Joel, in terms of setting up a program, launching it effectively, implementing successful implementation. What would your counsel be?
Yeah, it's a good question for the guy who most recently stood up a program. And we actually have been talking to New Mexico for a handful of years now. They have done a really great job of reaching out to other states to figure out what lessons they can learn from our experiences, as we did with California and Oregon. And I just want to say that CARB was really generous with their time and with some other things, their software, in helping us get up and running in Washington. But a key lesson that we learned is don't underestimate the amount of staff that you need for a program like this. Something that sometimes happens to states pursuing environmental policies that are not California is there's an assumption that, well, California did the heavy lift. They sort of developed a policy framework. Now your state can come along and it should just be a really quick, easy implementation. And while it's true that we don't have as many staff working on our clean fuels program as CARB does, it's still a really heavy lift for Washington, even though we're a smaller state, even though a lot of the heavy lifting was done by CARB. And that'll be the same for New Mexico and other states that come after. Don't underestimate the number of staff. Many of you in the room are active participants in LCFS programs. And so you understand there are times when you need information, and when you have fuel pathways that need to be approved, or when you have questions about your crediting or your fuel reports, and you need staff there to pick up the phone. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, don't reinvent the wheel where you don't need to. There is some really good policy development that's already been done. Use that and learn for it, but also look for ways that you can innovate, look for ways that you can adapt it to your own context. Every state is different. Every state's fuel mix is different. Every state's fuel regulations are different. And so look for ways that you can match the policy to your state. And then the third piece, and this is something that we are dealing with now in our upcoming rulemaking, it's something that's been a big topic of discussion in CARB's rulemakings, is aim for a balance when you develop your program. For something that is rigid enough to provide some regulatory certainty, but also flexible enough to adapt to changes in the market. You can make predictions about what the market's going to do, and they're just that, they're predictions. They will inevitably not be 100% accurate, and so you want to be able to adjust your market so that it's going to continue to be effective when, for example, you overperform.
Matt.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my advice really simple, and that is do it. Adopt a program. On the California side and the CARB side, as Joel mentioned this, more than willing to sit down and talk through with another jurisdiction that's interested in one of these programs, help them and provide lessons learned, because at its core, do it. Put a program in place. It'll help decarbonize your transportation fuel mix, and it'll really unlock a lot of investment. And the broader the fuels market gets in Canada, in the US, in North America, the more innovation that will happen, the better we will all be off for it, not just from a climate perspective, but from an air quality perspective. And so do it.
Yeah, I would say from the RNG developer's perspective, uniformity in the tools that you use, both for carbon intensity scoring and for tracking credits, tracking RNG injection and flow, et cetera. That's really important. It's just so difficult for the folks complying with the rule to learn what's required in each jurisdiction. If their requirements are dramatically different, it increases total cost of building and getting clean fuels to market. So we love the collaboration between the states on these policies. And to Joel's point about staff, I think as long as your first staff hire is someone like Joel or Bill Peters in Oregon or whatever, you're fine. But seriously, it's about the people in the agencies understanding these programs well at the outset, and they're not simple programs. And so any state that's trying to at least consider it politically, it's very smart to begin to learn about them early in the process and be ready when you're actually given the authority to quickly pull the tools from the existing models.
Well said, all of you. Sam, curious, what will be the revised stringency CARB adopts, and what will the credit price be in 2025?
I would love them to just listen to our recommendations and the recommendations of a broad set of clean fuel stakeholders that work together with the consulting firm ICF to demonstrate what ambition is possible. I already put the numbers out there, but I'll say it again. I think assuming that the diesel baseline issue remains adjusted as in the ISOR, then a 25% reduction by 2025 is feasible, and somewhere in the high 30s, low 40s in the 2030 timeframe would be possible. If that is done, I do think credit prices will recover. I'm not here to forecast exactly how much, but to the extent that CARB has in the past used credit prices in the hundreds for the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and other regulatory filings, I think you will see prices in that range again. And I don't think you'll see a price spike because the bank of credits that exists today is already very large, and we need to draw that down before there will be a strong new demand for aggressive expansion.
Joel, Matt, anything you'd like to share on this credit price question?
Matt?
I'm going to go to one more, and then did you have some?
Yeah.
And I'm going to have Matt do a few remarks, closed marks, and then we have a few minutes for questions. We'll do the best we can to get to them, and then wrap things up. I'll ask Sam, since you're going to have a response in a minute. And Sam, you're familiar with this, even though it's not directly in your lane today. You also touched on the 60% renewable diesel that we're at today. When do we transition out of petroleum diesel altogether in California? When does that target hit?
Yeah, obviously it depends on how aggressive the curve is and everything, but I think it's possible to be out of petroleum diesel, before 2030 in this state, which I think would be a fantastic story, and then to begin to eat into, jet demand with some of the same technologies. And yes, the debate around feedstocks is going to continue, but I think the EU recently started allowing, better treatment of some of the cover crops and the other options that hasn't been highly promoted by CARB yet. So if we can see camelina or some of the other options begin to get to scale in the U.S., that could be very helpful as well. But that's about as far as I'll go down to the liquid renewables path right now in my current role. Thanks.
So I will say, we're even with deep penetration on the liquid renewable side, and I made this point on this most recent Environmental Justice Advisory Committee meeting on Friday last week, which was we still have liquid fuel demand, particularly in the medium and heavy duty space, for decades to come. And so this is one of the core questions that we're working on as part of this LCFS rulemaking right now, given those vehicle technologies, given the fact that we'll have combustion engines, I think something on the order of close to still a third of the vehicles driving around in 2040, 2045 on the medium and heavy duty side will still be internal combustion engines based on our estimates. How do we make sure that we're getting some benefits into those vehicles through lower carbon fuels and making sure that we're continuing to reduce the carbon intensity of those fuels and bringing some of the criteria pollutant benefits into California?
Nicely stated. Now raise your hands if you have a question. And to the questions, clear, focused, hard, and call out the person you're particularly interested in responding initially.
Hi, this is for Matt. Richard talked about predictions. We started. I would love a prediction from you as to when we will have the mid-April workshop that CARB noticed. And as a corollary to that, when do you expect that the board will be taking up the LCFS amendment, and are you still targeting the beginning of 2025 for it to go into effect?
I was debating whether or not just to drop it in my opening remarks to head off that question, but thanks for asking. I appreciate it. So expect next week for an announcement on the date for the April workshop. Planning to do, as we said, mid-April workshop on the LCFS to discuss stringency and some of the comments and questions that have come up on crop-based biofuels, including the sustainability aspects of it. So expect the announcement on the workshop mid-next week. We are going to do a board hearing and a vote on the LCFS this year. We are going to get that in front of the board, and we are going to have an effective date, late 2024, early 2025. We are pushing hard to get this done because we understand the importance of it. I know there was some concerns about delay on the March board hearing, but there were substantial comments and lots of comments on stringency and lots of comments on crop-based biofuels. Wanted to have another workshop to reevaluate some of those pieces, so we'll be doing that. And like I said, expect that announcement early next week.
Thank you.
It's clear. Nice. Questions?
Yeah, Patrick Splicall with SCS. We're a VB. My question is for Sam. You made a comment earlier today regarding some innovative approaches in the Midwestern states. Could you expand on what you mean by innovative approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Midwest, if they chose to move forward with their own clean fuel standards, and I don't want to pick a state yet because there's actually many active conversations, Minnesota being the most longstanding, a model coming out of the Midwest that really understands how these feedstocks are grown and the opportunity to reduce emissions as feedstocks are grown could be really innovative and could really help the West Coast programs that have not been able to prioritize that topic with all the other many things they need to think about, better understand the opportunity to drive down emissions from crop-derived feedstocks. So that was raised in this iteration of CARB's rulemaking, but I mean, to give Matt, his due, like, so were 1,000 other topics, right? So I think it's important to keep those things in our mind, though, right? Like, the way that these crops are grown today doesn't have to be the only way they're grown in perpetuity, and there's opportunities there. Obviously, I work more on waste-derived feedstocks now, but if there remains a debate around the sustainability of the crop-derived feedstocks, let's work on the sustainability of the crop-derived feedstocks.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Why not? No. So when we were working on California's scoping plan for carbon neutrality by 2045, we also looked at how do we make sure that we reduce emissions from our natural and working lands, from our agricultural system here in California. We know that there are certain practices that can really help in reducing emissions from lands, reducing fertilizer emissions, reducing soil carbon loss. We know that certain practices can help store carbon in soils. And we, for the first time ever in our climate strategy, included on a statewide basis an objective to use natural and working lands to help support achieving carbon neutrality. We also initiated a process post-scoping plan to improve the level of action that we need for California agriculture and to assess some of those benefits. This is an evolving area in my mind on the science and what can be done and what needs to be done. And, we're clearly on the record, at least at CARB, about the importance of some of these climate smart ag practices. And I look forward to having those conversations in the future about how we could potentially do that within policies like the LCFS. We need to play this out a little bit more in California and nationally and make sure that we have the right science to be able to support that when you actually start talking about inclusion into a market program like this.
I want to direct all my questions to Matthew. But first of all, I'm Brian Furr with Biotown Biogas. Appreciate the opportunity to be able to ship gas from Indiana into the LCFS market and participate in that program very much. Simple question, actually. Can you get some additional help for Dr. Chin to get these projects approved a little bit faster? That's currently about a 9-month process, and projects run a little behind and take 6 months for reporting. So from the time a project is fully implemented and ready to go, it's about a 15 to 18 month lag time. That's rough on finance.
Yeah, no, well aware of the timelines, and I think as you mentioned, Ray deserves a hearty congratulations and thank you for all of the hard work that he does in processing all of these dairy swine manure pathways for so many of you and trying to get those through the certification and validation process. Honestly, the way I look at this is a number of things need to happen. We need to adjust the way in which we're taking in those pathways so that we can help accelerate the timeline to approval. And so, Ray actually and his team have been doing that by proposing updates to the Tier 1 process, the calculators, to allow for better use of those calculators that will help speed up the overall review and approval timeline. Resources are one. We've gotten a nominal increase in resources to help kind of review those pathways, but it's not going to be enough. It's like we feel like we're constantly playing, whack-a-mole. We get an extra person, and then all of a sudden the pathways increase even more because the program's successful. So we're adding people, but certainly not enough to be able to fully, move everything through as quickly as everybody would like. And then the other is other regulatory changes that we should consider, and that's why we're in a rulemaking update that would help in streamlining the approval process for pathways. I think there has to be some give and take here. We can't have a situation where every fuel producer is asking for every incremental change on their CI and constantly resubmitting their pathways and constantly asking for reevaluation of their pathways and then expecting it to be done right away. So, there is a little bit of a, give and take on how we review these pathways going forward, and changes that you all would like us to consider as part of the rulemaking process that gets more time, gets the time reduced on the pathway approval, but also, make sure that you're not just continuing to hammer the staff on the side.
And if I could add, the RNG Coalition has proposed we look more at the annual verified CI, basically the true performance of the projects, and have some sort of true up to credit to that true performance. That could alleviate some of the concerns around startup delay, because often you're generating under a temporary CI, which is not as good as your actual CI. So if we could true up that value, that would alleviate some of the pressure on CARB staff. And in the long run, many other offset markets, other things are based on actuals, not predicted greenhouse gas performance. And so the LCFS started out based on predicted, and you had to get your CI approved, and now you're supposed to just stick under it. Why not change it to be more based on actuals? We have the annual verification process now. We know what the real numbers are. Let's credit based on the real numbers.
And I'm just going to jump in there. I know the question was about CARB, but I want to offer everybody something that they can do to improve the situation in Washington. And I know many of you are active in both markets, which is that we have a recruitment open for a fuel pathway specialist right now. So if you know of anybody with a background in life cycle assessment, please send them to our website.
Nicely done, Joel. Way to close. We're going to have to end on that. And if for those that we didn't get to your questions, I'm sure that the team here will be willing to hang around a little bit to have the conversation with you. But excellent discussion, you guys. Ton of respect to you all.